Clemson avenged its regular season loss to Notre Dame, and Trevor Lawrence made his last case for the Heisman Trophy. Football season is over for UVA and Virginia Tech, but the news for those programs hasn't slowed down one bit. Virginia Tech wrapped up its non-league basketball play while UVA came back from a 17-day pause. This week on Teel and Barber. Hello and welcome to episode 34 of Teel and Barber, the Richmond Times-Dispatch and Richmond.com's Virginia Tech, UVA, and ACC sports podcast. I'm Mike Barber, ACC beat writer for the paper, and joining me here, as he always does, my co-host, the 13-time Sports Writer of the Year and the Virginia Sports Hall of Famer, David Teel. David, how are you?
Good morning, Mike. I'm well and hope everyone in your household is too.
We are hanging in there, getting into the holiday spirit. David, this will be our final show of 2020, and I think I speak for everyone when I say this is a year I'm very happy to move on from. I imagine you feel the same way in the Teel household?
Absolutely. We want to put it in our rearview mirror and hope and pray that 2021 is a little bit better and a little less eventful.
Right. Yeah. You know, the thing we want most of the holidays, it feels like, is for things to be a little normal. And it may be cliche to steal from holiday songs, but I'll ask this question, David. At your house, is it beginning to look a lot like Christmas?
Oh, it did the day after Thanksgiving when we went and got the tree and started pulling the decoration boxes out of the garage. So yeah, we've been ready to go. We've got a little countdown snowman in the family room, and that number right now is at 2.
We've been enjoying. We did the Hanukkah celebration here. Now we're on to Christmas, and the biggest change at Christmas this year for us is with Evan being my son, the 18-month-old baby. He's so mobile and so active. We've actually used a baby gate and protected the Christmas tree. Yeah. So we also had to redo kind of the best ornaments, the most special ornaments. They had to go near the top of the tree where the baby's less likely to rip them down. So that's been a big adjustment. But yeah, it's fun to get a little bit into the holiday spirit, and I think especially for the kids, but probably for the grown-ups too. It's just a good feeling to be celebrating, not as normal because we won't see family like we normally would. And we have had some different adventures with our gift giving. I know that at least one of our gifts apparently was en route from somewhere like the Ukraine and hasn't quite reached our house yet. So I don't know if Santa is going to pick up that one at the end here to push it across the finish line, or if we may get some delayed Christmas gifts. But it's certainly good to have holidays to celebrate nonetheless. Now, UVA and Virginia Tech, their football teams are both going to be home for the holidays. That's kind of unusual. They passed on bowl games this year. We've already talked about that and the reasons for that. A year ago at this time, I was covering the Orange Bowl with UVA, then hopping a quick flight to the Belk Bowl.
I did the same.
Yeah. Now for the first time in 8 years for me, and I'm going to ask because it's got to be so much longer for you, we're not covering bowl games this month. When was the last time you didn't cover a bowl game?
Actually, Mike, it hasn't been that long. I passed on, and I'm glad I did because it wasn't much of a game. I passed
Russell Athletic?
Yes. 2012 between your storied alma mater and Virginia Tech, and I remember watching that from home and thinking, wow, what a great decision I made.
Well, lucky man that was. Now, it was very exciting to see my alma mater play in a bowl game, but yeah, that was a dog of a football game. That was, if listeners remember, that was the game that ended there with both teams just couldn't wait to give the football back, turning it over, and that was an ugly one.
And it was a miserable weather night, wasn't it?
Yes. And it was, if I remember, there was some confusion about how to get from the press box to the interview room. And we were kind of rushing down there. And it was a year that everyone was anticipating big staff changes from Coach Beamer. I believe Kevin Sherman, the wide receiver coach, he already had like his phone and office and listing on the page at Purdue where he was off to. but nobody would tell us who had left and who was leaving, and what an odd time that was. But I think I also would agree that probably both of us would be looking forward to covering bowl games again next year.
Oh yeah, I mean, last year was among many seasons where I did multiple bowls, and it's always a fun way to wrap up the year. And I remember, just last Saturday night walking out of Bank of America Stadium after the ACC title game and thinking, well, that's a wrap. Put the binoculars away until next season.
Although with some of our basketball seating, you might want to keep those binoculars handy.
Point quite well taken.
That's a thing for sports writers, that it's certainly hard, and you hate to give up time with your family at this time of year. But I think for all of us, going to bowl games is kind of part of the holiday season, and that brings us rather quickly to this week's holiday edition of Who You Got.
Thanks, Mike. Which is the better holiday eve? Is it Christmas Eve or New Year's Eve? Let's start with David.
I think Christmas Eve is by far the better holiday, simply because for years now, decades even as I have aged, I have found New Year's Eve to be amateur night. And I just prefer the quiet and the peace and just kind of the internal reflection of Christmas Eve with those who are nearest and dearest.
Pretty good call. Mike, how about you?
So I'm going to go the opposite, but for a similar reason. I always loved the party of New Year's Eve when I was younger. I'm not younger anymore. There was a stretch where I could not stand New Year's Eve. It just, there was nothing in it for me, right? I was too old for the real party scene, but too young for what I enjoy now on New Year's Eve. And now what I enjoy is having kind of my wife and kids there, and it's thinking back on the year that was, thinking about the year that's coming. Now, obviously the children would still pick Christmas Eve because they know presents are coming. But there's something cool to me about New Year's Eve post-party age where it does, kind of like you said with walking out of that ACC championship, it puts the bow on the year for me. And I don't know, I enjoy that sort of hopeful feeling of what's coming. And I always find that no matter how I felt about the previous year, on New Year's Eve, I can think of a lot of things I really enjoyed about it. And it might be a challenge this year, right? But I think on New Year's Eve 2020, I'm going to look back and there's going to be things about this year that I really enjoyed.
I've spent far too many New Year's Eves in remote places like El Paso, Texas, with sports writers like you to have that much of an affection for the holiday.
And a bonus question, which is the better holiday eve beverage, Christmas eggnog or New Year's Eve champagne? Let's start with Mike.
I'm going to go, sticking with the New Year's theme, I'm going to go with the New Year's champagne. I've always enjoyed champagne. And it's interesting now with the kids, and especially with my daughter being old enough to understand what's happening, but obviously not old enough to drink champagne. We've kind of subbed in sparkling cider and sparkling apple juice for our New Year's drink. We also, as we've gotten older, don't always make it to midnight. So it might be more of a 9 o'clock toast with at least my daughter still awake. But champagne would be my choice if I'm picking one of the two.
What's your preference, David?
Oh, champagne gives me a headache, and not even a lot of it. So no, thank you. And I do like a nice eggnog with a little nip in it and a little nutmeg sprinkled on top. Thank you very much.
I'm going to have to give that a try. There was one Christmas that I was really into eggnog. I don't remember why, and I don't remember why I then got off it. But maybe we'll revisit it this year, as we obviously won't be going anywhere. So it is a perfect year to dip into some spiked eggnog.
Well, you won't be going anywhere unless you're, hanging out with the Washington football team's quarterback after the game.
What a poor decision that was.
Dwayne Haskins, what are you doing?
It's, I had some sympathy for guys, I think, at the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't know what we were in for and you didn't quite get it, and everybody. But now it's like, hey, well, however you feel about things, here are the rules. Here's what you have to do for your team. And goodness gracious, for a guy who's trying to salvage his career, that was a messy mistake.
Right, and get his team to the playoffs.
Yeah, how crazy is that? That we're heading into the holiday season and we still think that the Washington football team is relevant, and they are relevant in the NFL. So that was odd. Speaking of college football, and David, you mentioned it, you were in Charlotte for the ACC championship game, and the game we expected, right? Going into the year, Clemson, Notre Dame, that's what everybody said. Hey, Notre Dame was going to join the ACC for one season, and all signs were they were going to meet Clemson. Now we got a preview in a regular season matchup, but Clemson didn't have Trevor Lawrence in that one. And if you've watched college football for the last couple of years, you know Trevor Lawrence, he makes a big difference. So, David, this time they had him. He was there. He played well. This one wasn't really in much doubt, was it?
No, it wasn't. And selfishly, I was very disappointed because I was absolutely hoping for maybe not necessarily double overtime because of deadline purposes, but just hoping for fourth quarter drama. And there wasn't even third quarter drama in this, Mike. And you mentioned Trevor Lawrence, and very rarely do I handicap well, but the one thing I thought that was kind of an understated reason to think that his presence would be a large difference was just his ability to make plays with his feet. And sure enough, season high 90 yards rushing for Trevor Lawrence, including a 34-yard touchdown. I believe it was in the second quarter when Clemson pulled away. And just that threat of Lawrence on the RPOs opened things up for Travis Etienne. And Etienne, you'll remember, was limited to 28 yards in Notre Dame's victory in South Bend last month. And he goes for $120 something on Saturday, including a 44-yard touchdown. Clemson just had it all going on. That was angry, desperate, motivated Clemson. And when they're that way, they are a load.
Yeah, that's a great point. I thought, and we talked about it last week, the importance of Trevor Lawrence as a runner, the importance of his ability to dissect a defense and know when it's going to be there, to stay out of bad plays because of his ability to recognize what's happening. I think Trevor Lawrence is a little bit underappreciated in that regard. But as I watched that game play out, I thought, man, David and I really know what we're talking about, because our preview of that game was exactly what we ended up getting. And I think you make a great point, too, about the motivation. Not that Notre Dame lacked motivation, because there was question about what would happen with them if they didn't play well. But that was Clemson, the Clemson program that we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years in the championship mode, right? In that championship drive, this is the way they play. And it doesn't matter who the opponent is. They have the chance to be dominant. Now, both these teams, you know, they go to Charlotte thinking they're headed to the playoffs, hoping they're headed to the playoffs. Clemson probably understanding it needed to win to get there. The way it all shook out, is this right? Is the way they got the college football playoff right?
I think the selection committee got the top 4 absolutely right, Mike. I mean, it came down to Notre Dame or Texas A&M, both with one loss for that 4th and final spot. And to me, it's not even close if you look at the overall body of work. A&M has beaten 2 teams, 2 with winning records, Florida and Auburn. Notre Dame has beaten 4. That would be Pittsburgh, Boston College, and, oh, by the way, Clemson, which is in the playoff, and number 13, North Carolina. And to me, it's interesting that the committee, and I think rightly so, looked at Notre Dame's ACC schedule and judged it as more difficult than A&M's SEC schedule. And how many times ever could you have said that the ACC would be held in higher regard than the SEC? It's a one-season snapshot, and it's a peculiar season at that. But I do think the committee got that part right. Where I think the committee was really wrong was its treatment of the group of 5 teams, particularly Cincinnati and Coastal Carolina. I thought they were ranked way too low. And I think Cincinnati belonged in the discussion for that 4th spot, but clearly at number 8, the Bearcats were an afterthought.
Yeah, that was the part that surprised me. I didn't think that Cincinnati or certainly Coastal was going to crack the top 4. And it's hard. You've got to separate people when they're up on their soapboxes here. I think Cincinnati and Coastal Carolina were done horribly wrong by the selection committee, not because they weren't included in the championship picture. That's a debate about the structure and how it all works for another time. But in terms of the New Year's Six Bowls, in terms of where they finished in the rankings, it just seemed like the committee didn't study them. Like the committee didn't really put much time in. They said, oh, yeah, they are where they are. They're unbeaten, but, they didn't really play anybody that great. And let's just sprinkle them in here somewhere in these rankings when we're done. I just, for a group that seems to put so much time and effort into splitting hairs, right? That's what this committee does. It seems like they combed over, if you will, Cincinnati and Coastal Carolina, what they did. And I thought that was disappointing because I agree with you. I think the most important part, the top 4, I think they got that right.
Yeah. Consider Coastal Carolina, Mike, undefeated. And one of those wins was over Louisiana. And you're thinking, okay, who's Louisiana? Well, Louisiana happened to open its season by beating to death on the road Iowa State by 17 points. Iowa State has lost 3 games. Again, I repeat, Coastal Carolina has lost none. But yet Iowa State is ranked ahead of Coastal Carolina in the final CFP poll. It's indefensible in my book.
That's what I mean. It looks like a mistake. It looks like they forgot to evaluate what Coastal Carolina had done. And I also thought that Coastal Carolina deserved more credit for that BYU win, not just because it was a good win, but because of the way they took it on. Mm-hmm. They said, hey, we know this has been a weird year. We haven't been able to schedule the way we normally would. We know we need to do more to impress the selection committee. And they played BYU, a good BYU team, on short notice and won. And BYU deserves credit for that too, for playing that game. But my point is, this is a team that not only did they take care of business every week they played, not only do they have the victories they have, but they went out and did more. They did their part. They did extra work to impress the committee. And it's not that they were snubbed. To me, it feels like they were ignored. It feels like nobody took the time to look at what 11-0 meant at Coastal Carolina this year. And I thought that was, for me at least, disappointing.
Yeah, but how cool did they end up in the Cure Bowl against Liberty, who they were supposed to play in December, the game that got canceled, which is why BYU came to Conway, South Carolina in the first place. And then all of a sudden now you get Liberty and Coastal in a bowl, which is nice.
Yeah, it's nice, I guess. I don't know. If you're a Coastal Carolina fan, don't you want a name opponent? Don't you want somebody bigger than Liberty? I get what you're saying, and it is a good football matchup, but
it really is 11-0 against 9-1.
It's one of the games I'll be looking forward to watching, but I don't know. Coastal Carolina, to me, they deserve a shot against somebody who's up there in the rankings to kind of legitimize themselves. And I felt like the final rankings denied them that. But hey, you don't always get what you deserve in this life, do you? And that brings us to the topic of the Heisman Trophy. Now, we're not allowed to reveal who we voted for, but I'm curious your thoughts in terms of maybe getting what you deserve. Trevor Lawrence's case for the award, and it just feels to me like there was such an expectation around Trevor Lawrence that almost anything he did would have seemed like he came up short. He was named the ACC Player of the Year today, rightfully so. He's a finalist for the Maxwell and the Davey O'Brien Awards for the best player and the best quarterback in college football. I'm sure he'll be a finalist for the Heisman. I don't know whether or not he'll win it. But David, did it feel like we expected Trevor Lawrence to cure COVID and to end world hunger and to win a national title before we were going to say that he lived up to expectations?
Well, and I think part of that, Mike, is Trevor Lawrence was so front and center during the debate of whether there was even going to be a season. Trevor was out there on, let us play, we want to play. He kind of spearheaded that social media campaign. And he was also very active along with teammate Darian Rencher when it came to social issues on campus there at Clemson. So he is the face of college football. And when you are that, when you take on that mantle, Not that he took it on voluntarily, it was kind of foisted upon him, but much is expected. And oh, by the way, the cat is, and I know the Heisman is not a career achievement award, but the dude is 34-1 as a starter, which is just ridiculous. I mean, it is truly amazing. And as Dabo Sweeney points out often, Trevor Lawrence hasn't seen many fourth quarters. I mean, his numbers could be a heck of a lot better, but they're not.
When people talk about, the expectations for Trevor Lawrence, now I saw him play twice in person. You saw him play twice in person this season. There is no metric that I have at my disposal in which he didn't live up to expectations. That's the part that I'm having trouble with. I guess people are getting bogged down by total statistics, but Clemson didn't lose a game when he played, okay? The guy was great in big spots. He led them to another ACC championship. He has them back in the playoff. I am struggling with the narrative that Trevor Lawrence didn't quite deliver on the lofty expectations because other than piling up some garbage time stats, what was missing? Or are we blaming him for testing positive and missing a game with COVID?
He missed two.
Missing 2 games.
Right. And, oh, by the way, every game that Trevor Lawrence played, Clemson won by at least 18 points.
The guy was great this year. He was great this year. So, David, we won't put either of us on the spot with who we voted for. We're not allowed to reveal that. But tell me this. When it's all said and done, do you think Trevor Lawrence is the guy who wins the Heisman?
No, I don't. I think Devontae Smith is going to win, the Alabama receiver. Again, based on his numbers are so off the charts. And and he is truly spectacular. And 15 catches, I think I have that right, the other night in the SEC championship game.
Huge game, monster game.
Against Florida. And oh, by the way, when did the SEC morph into the Big 12? I missed the memo there because it seems every game in that league this season, both teams were in the 40s, if not 50s. I mean, didn't that used to be a line them up and play defense conference? It
sure did.
It is not anymore. But my hunch is Smith wins, but I wouldn't. I mean, most years who's going to win the Heisman. I suspect Smith will win, but I wouldn't bet you a nickel on it.
Yeah, hard year to pick. And our good friend Wes McElroy, who I believe, if I remember right, was the first guest we ever had on this podcast. I was on his radio show the other day. We were talking. This feels like a year where if they hand the Heisman Trophy to Trevor Lawrence, if they hand it to Devontae Smith, if they hand it to Mac Jones, if they hand it to Kyle Trask, this feels like a year where I'd feel good about any of those guys. Those guys all had really, I thought, great seasons. So to me, that takes off a little pressure as a Heisman voter. I didn't look at my list of guys that I was considering and think, man, some of these guys shouldn't win a Heisman. Like all of these guys put up incredible years in incredible circumstances. And, there's still a lot of magic to that trophy, and it'll be fun to watch and see who ends up walking away with the hardware. Now, from an ACC quarterback shooting for another championship, shooting for a Heisman, to the quarterback carousel at Virginia Tech, David Hendon Hooker, Tech starter for most of the past 2 seasons, he announced he's entering the transfer portal. He's leaving the program. This comes less than a month after Quincy Patterson, one of Hooker's backups, also bolted. Patterson's already hooked up with North Dakota State. How do we feel about this sort of in and out revolving door at the quarterback position at Virginia Tech?
It's college football. Quarterback. I mean, I don't know if anybody has broken down the numbers of, what percentage of quarterback signees at the Power 5 level end up transferring, but it is a ton. And I'm never surprised when a quarterback transfers because they all want to play, and most of them believe they should be playing. And when they don't, they're out of there. And it's going to only get worse now that the one-time transfer waiver is coming.
But David, that's all fine and good. But Hendon Hooker was this team's starting quarterback until the final game of the season.
Right.
Did things go so sideways when he got quote unquote got cold against Clemson, that was it? I mean, had Hendon Hooker lost his job completely, had Tech moved on, and then it was time for him to move on? Is that what this transfer tells us?
Yes. No, I really think so. I think it got sideways in a hurry between Hooker and the coaching staff and in the locker room. That's just my sense of it. And he wanted out. And remember, this is the second time he's hit the portal. And the first time he came back, clearly he's not coming back this time. But no, as soon as the whole Clemson thing, I mean, you were there that night. I was not. But when I watched the whole thing unfold, my immediate response was transfer portal. I knew he was out of there that day.
That's interesting. It took me a little longer. It was when we found out that he was healthy and available for the UVA game and he wasn't the quarterback and there wasn't a rotation. I said, okay, if you're the coaches and you're trying at all to keep this kid, he's getting a few series, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, even if you're saying, hey, we're not quite sure what happened last week, we had to prepare this way, you can spin it if you give the kid the third and sixth series of the game. They just sat him on the bench. And I'm with you at that point. I said, it's over. Now, here's why it's a concern to me, because everybody has transfers, right? You talked about that. College football is transfer now. That's what it is. And you're not playing, you leave. I get that. Hendon Hooker, maybe he wasn't going to play anymore. But think about the history that this team now has of quarterbacks. Think about Gerard Evans, who led them to a Coastal Division title and then bolted for the NFL. Now, kids do that, right? They make bad decisions sometimes. But Gerard Evans bolted. He left. He wanted out. Josh Jackson, they tell him he's going to have to compete with Ryan Willis. What does he do? He leaves, even though I think most of us think like he was going to win the job again. At least I did. I thought Josh Jackson was going to beat out Ryan Willis and be the starting quarterback. He didn't stick around. He transfers to Maryland. A.J. Bush, who had signed with this staff, transferred to Illinois. Now Patterson, being used as kind of the third or the backup, transfers to NDSU. Hooker's heading out now. We just talked about his case. It's unusual. But, David, it's got to be troubling that this head coach who's a quote unquote, quarterback whisperer. Quarterbacks don't seem to be in love with the idea of sticking it out with him.
Nope, I agree. And it's not a great look at that position. Again, it's the most common position to transfer, but yeah, you're going to have, I don't know if this will be reflected in future recruiting at the quarterback position. Will elite type quarterbacks be hesitant to come to Blacksburg? I do not know, but clearly they have been unable to sign someone, groom them, bring them along, and have them stick it out. Haven't been able to do it yet, and those programs that can, usually have it work out for them. Case in point, the young man we were talking about earlier, Trevor Lawrence.
Yeah, and it's odd. And I know Virginia Tech likes to point out that they don't have the most kids in the transfer portal, and that's true. I mean, at last check, Georgia Tech had about a dozen. UNC had about a dozen. Tech had 7 or 8. So they don't lead the ACC in guys in the transfer portal. The reason they get talked about and the reason they get banged on is they've got people in the portal who are starters, right? Like, look at the 2 linemen, Brian Hudson and Doug Nestor. Those guys were guys who were in the starting lineup and presumably would have been that. We don't know if things got, sideways in the locker room with them or with the coaches, but talent-wise, playing time-wise, they were in line to be starting linemen next year, Hudson and Nestor. When guys like that are leaving your program, guys who are getting playing time, that's why it becomes a narrative. And that's why it becomes a national narrative, because people are saying, hey, UVA had a couple kids this week enter the transfer portal, right? Heskin Smith and another one of the defensive backs, I think Darnell Pratt, they entered the transfer portal. They're backup guys. They didn't play much. A bunch of other defensive backs announced they were coming back for another season. And those kids said, hey, I'm not going to see the field. I'm going to go somewhere else. And I don't think anybody criticizes college teams when kids who aren't playing leave. But Tech seems to be losing these kids who are starters, who are frontline talent, who are key pieces. And I think that's why it's worth talking about.
I think Hudson and Nestor are bigger hits than Hooker.
Yes.
Really do.
Agree.
And you just can't have enough quality offensive linemen, and those 2 fit the bill. And, of course, as we expected, Christian Darrisaw is headed off to the NFL. So all of a sudden that becomes, pretty big rebuild up front for Vance Weiss and the rest of the coaching staff. Those are the two you were like, wow. And they were big time recruits too.
Mm-hmm.
But both in that 4-star territory. So if you're looking for something that is not good optically, I think those two more so than Hooker.
Yeah, the quarterback is sexy, right? That's always going to be the headline grabber. Offensive line, they've worked so hard to build up that position. And to your point, nobody has criticized Virginia Tech for Christian Darrisaw leaving.
Oh, no.
Right? They developed that kid into a potential first-round draft pick. That is a success story. Even though he's leaving early, that's not saying anything negative about. That's a positive for Virginia Tech. They took this kid who a lot of people overlooked and helped mold him into a potential first-round draft pick. And when he's got that shot, he should go. But there has to be a line there of who's going to take his spot. And when the guys who are lined up to take his spot and who are now getting their shot are looking for the door, it's a problem. Now, at quarterback, you said, you think those linemen are bigger than the Hooker departure. Is that because Braxton Burmeister, the Oregon transfer, he went 3-1 in the starter. He led them to the win over UVA. So, David, when you say you're more concerned about the lineman than Hooker, is Burmeister's ability part of what you're factoring in there?
Yes. I think he's a nice piece to start with at quarterback. I also think they're going to be in the transfer market. I think they'll bring in somebody else.
Yeah, and rightfully so. And that's not even a criticism of Burmeister, right? Like, no. You have to have 2 or 3 quarterbacks, and there's just left.
Yeah, so, like UVA bringing in Ketone Thompson. Brennan Armstrong was the heir apparent to Bryce Perkins, but yet in the offseason, Bronco Mendenhall took Ketone Thompson from Mississippi State. Now, he ended up being more of a hybrid, but I absolutely expect Virginia Tech to hit the portal and take a quarterback.
So Burmeister is the last quarterback standing, if you will, and that brings us to this week's Take It or Leave It.
Thank you, Mike. 1 or 2 of those Virginia Tech quarterbacks leaving was inevitable, given the landscape of college football and the NCAA transfer portal. Let's start with David. Take it or leave it.
Oh, I'm taking it. Yeah. You had to know that either that from among the group, Burmeister, Patterson, Hooker, at least one was going to leave. And Patterson seemed like the most likely because he was playing the least throughout the season. It's the second one. You're like, oh, now they're going to have to go get somebody else.
Mike?
Yeah, I'll take it. And that was sort of my thought was, I thought between Hooker and Burmeister, one of them was going to go. And when we saw the way that the season ended, it made sense that it was Hooker. I thought Patterson was going to stick it out. The kid had played a lot. He had played in some big spots. And knowing that or anticipating that either Hendon Hooker or Braxton Burmeister would be gone, he would be the clear number 2 on a team that seems like it's going to use 2 quarterbacks. It just seemed like next year was the year he was working to. So I'm not surprised at all that Hooker / Burmeister left. One of them was going to go. I thought Patterson was going to stick it out, and next year might be the year that we really see him blossom into a player. That's my disappointment here is he put in a lot of time. Tech put in a lot of time with him, and it would have been interesting to see how that played out. Now, David, you mentioned Ketone Thompson at UVA. The NCAA said this year doesn't count for eligibility. Ketone Thompson was one of 17 4th and 5th year players at UVA who say, yeah, thanks. We're going to take advantage of that rule. We're going to come back and play again in 2021. That's a huge boost, David, for Bronco Mendenhall, especially on the offensive and defensive line, the secondary. What did you think of the group that said, hey, we're coming back?
Yeah, you mentioned the offensive line. Chris Glazer is one of the guys who announced that he's coming back. And then in the secondary, you've got Joey Blunt coming back at safety, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that's large. I mean, the entire offensive line should be back for the Cavaliers, along with Brennan Armstrong, who was obviously not among that group because he's younger. That's a nice piece or nice pieces for Bronco Mendenhall and his staff to take into 2021.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's just, it's interesting because UVA had some losses, right? Charles Snowden, Zane Zandier, they're both turning pro, and that makes sense. We talked about those two backup DBs who are in the portal, but overall, this is about as good a start to the offseason for Bronco Mendenhall and UVA as you can have. And I looked at the lineup they played against Tech and, their final game. That entire offensive line is coming back. The entire defensive secondary that started that game is coming back. So you look at some things to build on. And to me, in that announcement, Virginia went from I'm not sure how they're going to look next year to me thinking, hey, that's going to be a pretty decent team, actually, in 2021.
Yeah. Now they have to address running back and wideout.
Yes, because they did have, we did not see any of those names in there. Well, Rashawn Henry, the transfer.
Yes, who will help.
Yes, and was coming on as the year went on. And
absolutely was. His first 4 catches of the season went for touchdowns, if I recall correctly. And that was a name that jumped off the page to me. But, I mean, running back is where... I mean, we saw it this year in Blacksburg. What Khalil Herbert meant to the Hokies, and where would they have been without Khalil Herbert? And earlier I was looking today. Here's how good the ACC was this season, especially a running back. Among those in the country with at least 100 carries this season, Khalil Herbert is second, only to North Carolina's Michael Carter in yards per carry. And Khalil Herbert is third team all ACC.
Yeah. And I don't know that you could argue with that. I mean, you can argue, but I don't think that was a terrible selection. No, it was a very deep year, good year at running back. And, Virginia, I thought, had a good player in Shane Simpson that they got through the transfer portal. He is not coming back. He's headed to turn pro. But another player like that, could be the missing piece because Brennan Armstrong's coming back, and we'll talk in a future episode about what he got out of this year and his development. But the offensive line's back, the quarterback's back. You get a stud running back in with that, and I think people are going to be talking quite highly about Virginia when the year comes. It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see the transfer market this offseason, maybe more than any season we've looked at in recent years. Now.
Yeah. No, I think you'll see Virginia in the transfer market at those two positions, running back and wideout.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and maybe outside linebacker too, because they need a little more depth, I would think, there. Now, transitioning to basketball, Virginia Tech, it wrapped up its non-league schedule, decisive home win over Longwood on Monday night. That was a win that at that point made the Hokies the ACC's league leader in a most significant category, I would say, this COVID year. They led the league in games played. Tech had played 8 games at that point. They were 6-1 in non-league games, plus they had an ACC win over Clemson. David, before we talk about Mike Young's team on the floor, how encouraging is it that Mike Young's team got on the floor 8 times?
Hey, the NCAA requirement to reach the tournament this year, or to at least qualify to be considered, is 13 games. 8 down, 5 to go. I mean, that's how I would look at it.
Absolutely.
I think that is a serious win to get all 7 non-conference games. That's the most they could have played. Got them all in, and now it's on the conference season. And from what we've seen, of course, there's no chance that the Hokies will play all 20 league games. There's just too many starts and stops. But yeah, the fact that they've been on the floor 8 times, good on them. And I'm sure that Mike Young is very happy.
Yeah, it's such a critical point you make when you think about the number for the tournament, because not only did they play 8, they won 7 of them. They beat Villanova. They have a league win already over Clemson.
Yeah.
So
a good Clemson team.
Very good. And so if they run into trouble in the second half of the year, they're still going to be within striking distance. Wake Forest has only played twice. They've only played twice, David. It's almost Christmas. We're talking about Christmas. They've only played 2 games. They're in a hole. UVA with the big break. We're going to talk about that in a second. So it is unusual to just get the inventory that Tech has. Now, on the floor, I think we've got to like a lot of what we've seen. I think I look at Keve Aluma and what he's given them. And, I thought Mike Young, oddly, downplayed him going into the year. And maybe it was just not wanting to have expectations too high, or maybe he's done more than Mike Young expected. But, Mike kind of billed him as the Robin, right? He wasn't a Batman. He was a Robin. He was kind of a guy who could play big minutes and could score and could rebound, but he wasn't going to be the star. David, he's been the leading scorer, the leading rebounder. He's been the star so far.
Absolutely. I kind of thought that might be the case. Mike Young may have downplayed it a little bit, but I thought if you read between the lines of some of his remarks, you got the feeling that they knew from having had Aluma at Wofford and then that redshirt year that he was really going to be a difference maker. And in fact, I think it was Mike who used this line that often in practice last year, Chester Fraser, one of his assistants, would say, "Man, if we could have him playing now, how good would we be?" And they have him now, and we see how good they can be.
Yeah, it's been impressive. They have other pieces too. Jalen Cone, since he's come back from that injury, his 3-point shooting, man, when he gets going, David, he is a weapon.
Yeah, and he's got no conscience, which you love to see with shooters. And if you're good enough, I mean, Mike Young's history, as he showed at Wofford, he will, Fletcher McGee set the NCAA record for made threes. He'll let you go. He'll green light you without hesitation if you earn it. And I think Jalen Cone has earned it.
Yeah, it's interesting coming out of the Buzz Williams years, and obviously very successful. And Buzz had that kind of a great shot, good shot, and perfect shot. And he really wanted to get away from anything other than a perfect shot. And I think this is a better fit, right, for Jalen Cone, because, Mike Young wants you to take good, smart shots. But to your point, a good, smart shot doesn't necessarily mean you're not covered or you're not behind the line. I mean, if you're Jalen Cone, go ahead and let it rip. And I think Naheem Alain, too. I think they've got some real good shooters, and I think they're going to be carried to some wins on some nights when things are off in other areas by that shooting. I think more often they're going to be carried to wins by their defense. And I was really impressed in the Villanova win with their on-ball defense, with Bisa Bede certainly, but their just ability to rotate, to guard the basketball. David, I think that's ultimately what's going to define this team.
They were really good defensively against Clemson too. Mm-hmm. Very good. And yes, that is where and defense and rebounding kind of go hand in hand. And that's where they needed to get better. And Mike Young and his staff knew it, and they addressed it through the transfer market, and it's really paid off. And you're seeing it on the court. And now they're going to get into ACC play. And you mentioned the 3-point shooting. How many did they make against Coppin? 20? Which is just, insane. I think it was Chris Coleman, our friend from Tech Sideline, tweeted that night, "Hey guys, save some of these for ACC play." But I was thinking, obviously they crushed Coppin that night, and you got to be careful comparing scores. Duke beat Coppin by 10. Okay? I mean, it was competitive throughout. It wasn't like that was a 30-point game and all of a sudden Coppin drew within 10 in the last 5 minutes of garbage time. That was a game for 40 minutes, and yet, Hokies just kicked it into gear that night. Well, they're going to be really intriguing to watch.
So by the transitive property, Duke better watch out, right? That's
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, we mentioned defense. Defense wins championships. We know that because we also cover UVA, and they rode that nation's best defense to a title. Now, the Cavaliers, they had to take a long pause here due to COVID issues. David, you wrote about this. I mean, how long? The longest pause in 40-something years?
Yeah, 1978. Which obviously wasn't a COVID pause or a pandemic pause. It was just a weird scheduling quirk. They went from, I think it was, like December 5th against Randolph-Macon of all people. And then to after Christmas, I think, against Providence. But it was more than 3 weeks. And, this time, 17, 18 days between the Kent State game and then yesterday against William and Mary.
Now, they had some big-time matchups that I was looking forward to, wiped out in Michigan State and Villanova, and they were off all this time. And the kids told us after the game last night that they were able to get in the gym individually, shoot on a half court that had been sanitized and kind of get some shots up. They were able to meet as a team at night on Zoom, meet virtually, go over film, go over strategy. But David, I was impressed with what I saw on the floor. Now, you were at the game against William and Mary. They didn't look that rusty, did they?
No, especially Kihei Clark.
Yeah.
He had not started, I guess it was the Kent State game, and I'm sure Tony Bennett was sending him a message. And I thought he was really good. I mean, he only scored 6 points, but they were 6 early points. He was so good on the ball defensively. William Mary had 17 turnovers. I'll bet you Kihei Clark had a role in 5 or 6 of them. I mean, just pestering people, quick hands, drew a couple charges. They really frustrated, I thought, Luke Lowy, William and Mary's best player and an 18-point-a-game scorer. He only had 5 yesterday, none in the first 17 minutes. Clark was on him. Trey Murphy was on him. Casey Morcell. They rotated defenders. But, yeah, I thought they were really good on that end, except for a little stretch there at the beginning of the second half.
Yeah, we in the football talk, we praised Coastal Carolina and BYU for putting a game together kind of last minute. It's a good thing, I think, that UVA played this William and Mary game because they've added a game kind of last minute against a team. And if you're looking for their name in the rankings, go all the way up to the top because they've added number 1 Gonzaga to the schedule. So we can be sad about losing the matchup with Tom Izzo's Spartans. I know Joey Hauser certainly is the matchup with his brother. We could be sad about losing the matchup with Jay Wright's Villanova team. I was really interested to see how that compared to what Virginia Tech was able to do. But hey, getting a game in a neutral site against Mark Few's Gonzaga team, number 1 in the country, this is pretty cool. David, how did this game come to be?
COVID.
Yeah.
Isn't that how they all come to be on short notice?
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah. They were supposed to play, they meaning Gonzaga, they were supposed to play Baylor.
Yeah.
In what would have been a 1-2 matchup. I believe they were supposed to play in Indianapolis. But that game got scuttled. And so CBS, which had the television rights to that game, went looking for a replacement and approached Virginia. And this was during the early part of Virginia's COVID pause, when Tony Bennett thought mistakenly that he could still play Villanova last Saturday. And he was prepared to play Villanova on the 19th and Gonzaga on the 26th. I mean, that would have been a pair of non-conference challenges now. But, the Villanova game could not happen. And now they'll go to Fort Worth and hopefully play Gonzaga. And wow, I haven't seen a lot of Gonzaga, but Gonzaga has arguably the 3 best wins in the country.
Yeah.
I mean, they've beaten Iowa, Kansas, and West Virginia, all of them top 10 teams.
Yeah,
and by the way, none of them at home.
Yeah, I watched that Iowa game, and I watched it anticipating a real down-to-the-wire. I thought that was a big-time showdown matchup, and Gonzaga was actually, I thought, in a different league. I mean, they were just their offense, Gonzaga, is so good, which is what makes this matchup so exciting, and I'm really looking forward to watching it. I think Virginia's defense is still tweaking, still fine-tuning, but we know what Virginia's defense is. We know how it's designed. We know how it's emphasized, how it's coached. I think they're a really good defensive team again this year. Gonzaga is as good an offensive team as I've seen in a while. I think they have all kinds of weapons offensively. I'm really looking forward to the, cliche, but clash of styles in this one.
Mike, Virginia held William and Mary to 40 points yesterday. If Virginia can hold Gonzaga to 40 and a half, they'll be doing really well. Now, somewhere, Tony Bennett, well, I'm sure he's a loyal listener to the podcast, by the way.
I hope so.
He would get hives if he heard that. But I'm telling you, and the Suggs kid, the freshman point guard, I mean, everybody's talking about him, and you don't normally associate this with Gonzaga. He won and done, and he's going in the top 5 of the draft.
Yeah, that's not the way Mark Few has built that team, but it's the reward for the way Mark Few has built that team, right? Yeah. Like, he's built a program that, okay, we don't care about the league or the location or anything. Like, Gonzaga is as big a name in college basketball as there is, and now they're in the market for guys like Suggs. And just going to be a phenomenal matchup. And I think you're right, David. I mean, I think if that game is played in the 70s, I think that's a huge victory for UVA and gives them a great shot. If it's in the 80s and 90s, unless it's in double overtime, I'm not loving their chances. But I am loving the fact that CBS, UVA, Gonzaga, they gifted us a Christmas present here right as we go into the holiday season, because this is a game for us to look forward to. And with that, David, I wish you and your family a very happy holidays, Christmas, New Year's. It's been fun doing this show this year. We're looking forward to coming back next year, but very happy holiday to you and yours.
Mike, same to you and all in your orbit, and of course to all our listeners.
Well, thanks for listening. You can subscribe to Teel and Barber on Apple Podcasts or wherever you find your favorite shows. Please consider supporting local journalism with an online subscription to the Times-Dispatch. If you're looking for a last-minute Christmas gift, you can find special promotional offers available at richmond.com. Today's show was produced by Dean Hoffmeyer. Teel and Barber is a podcast of the Richmond Times-Dispatch and richmond.com. For David Teel, I'm Mike Barber. Thanks for listening. Be healthy and safe. Enjoy the holidays. Happy New Year. And please join David and me again in 2021.